So candidates who memorize and, actually read from a prepared word-for-word script during a job negotiation, they earn an average of $20,000 more a year than those who just walk in and try to wing it.
Right. Which completely shatters that whole myth that the best negotiators are just these naturally charismatic people who can think on their feet.
Exactly.
I mean, that statistic from recent compensation research really proves that securing your financial worth is a highly choreographed performance. It's not an improv show.
Welcome to this deep dive on the English effect. Today, we are tearing down the mechanics of probably the most high-stakes conversation you're ever going to have in your professional life, which is negotiating your salary.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a crucial topic for our listeners.
It really is. And we have an incredibly dense stack of sources today. We're looking at negotiation theory from Harvard, the latest global labor reports, and some really specific linguistic analysis.
Yeah, because the mission here is to give you, the listener, a practical, psychological, and most importantly for us, grammatical toolkit to walk into that room and literally change your financial trajectory.
Right, because the urgency for this toolkit is just, well, it's difficult to overstate. A recent global wage report laid out a pretty stark reality. Global real wage growth was sitting at just 1.8% recently.
Which is wild.
It is. And when you overlay that sluggish growth with the relentless pressure of global inflation, that traditional corporate playbook of just keeping your head down, working hard, and waiting for an annual 3% raise.
It just doesn't work anymore.
No, it's a guaranteed path to losing your purchasing power over time.
You basically have to force the issue. But before we even get to the specific English vocabulary you should use at the table, we kind of have to establish what you're actually fighting for, right?
Right.
If you walk into a room blind to how modern compensation works, I mean, the most persuasive script in the world won't save you.
Yeah, let's talk about that term, total compensation. It's a great piece of business vocabulary.
It really is. Total compensation is shifting radically. We aren't just talking about a base salary and a basic health insurance plan anymore. Employers are totally restructuring how they distribute value.
Right, like we saw in a recent HR benefits survey. Traditional perks are changing. Relocation lump sums, the money they give you to move.
Yeah, those are plummeting. Only about 27% of employers are offering them now, which is down from 31% just a year before.
But at the same time, we're seeing these hyper-modern perks pop up. Like companies are fully subsidizing premium AI chatbot subscriptions for their employees to drive tech adoption.
Wow, yeah. Which introduces a really dangerous cognitive trap for candidates. The researchers at Harvard call this the vividness bias.
Vividness bias, I like that. Let's break that down for the listeners. What does that actually mean?
So it's a cognitive shortcut. Basically, our brains disproportionately weight flashy, easily quantifiable detail.
The vivid stuff.
Right, exactly. While completely ignoring the mundane structural factors that actually dictate our daily quality of life.
Oh, I see. So the base salary number is like the ultimate vivid detail. It's this massive, shiny metric.
Exactly. It is incredibly easy for a hiring manager to just dangle a top-tier base salary in front of you, knowing that the vividness of that huge number will blind you to the fact that, well, they offer zero schedule flexibility.
Right, or terrible management culture, or just a grueling commute.
Yeah.
It's basically the professional equivalent of renting a luxury apartment just because it has a gorgeous rooftop pool.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. The pool is vivid. You imagine yourself there every weekend, so you sign the lease, but you totally ignore the dull detail that the apartment has paper-thin walls and is located directly above a 24-hour freight train line.
Exactly. You use the pool maybe twice a year, but you lose sleep every single night.
Yeah. So if you only negotiate for the vivid base salary, you are totally ignoring the train line.
And to avoid that trap, you need structural leverage before you even begin to discuss those numbers. And this is where we get into some great business terminology. The core framework relies on establishing your BATNA.
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 Right. It stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. Basically, what is your tangible reality if you push your chair back, thank them for their time, and walk out of the room today?
Okay, let me challenge the psychology of that for a second, though. If I spend the days leading up to a crucial interview, meticulously planning my escape route,
Right.
reminding myself that I can just stay at my current mediocre job or take a lesser offer from a competitor, doesn't that fundamentally weaken my drive?
How do you mean?
Well, it feels like I'm cultivating this aloofness that might make me just walk away at the very first sign of friction, Like I'm giving up on a role I actually really want.
I get that. It sounds totally counterintuitive, but grounding yourself in your BATNA actually alters your neurobiology in the room for the better.
Really? Yeah. The anxiety you feel during a negotiation, like the racing heart, the sweating, that's your amygdala treating the conversation as a literal life or death threat.
Oh, wow.
If you don't have an alternative, your brain perceives losing this job offer as a survival failure. So by explicitly defining a safe, acceptable alternative beforehand, you basically turn off the fight or flight response.
So you aren't cultivating aloofness, you are neutralizing desperation.
Exactly. That biological calm is what allows you to hold your ground when the employer inevitably pushes back.
So you're lowering the internal stakes so you can raise the external demands. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that internal state directly impacts the negotiating style you naturally default to.
Right, because researchers have categorized bargaining into 5 distinct archetypes. We've got collaborating, competing, accommodating, compromising, and avoiding.
Let's talk about the data on those styles because it reveals a really fascinating paradox. Candidates who utilize a competing strategy, where they treat the negotiation as a zero-sum game to extract maximum value.
Right, they walk away with the highest financial gains.
Yeah, averaging a $5,000 increase in starting pay compared to the other styles. But those who use a collaborating strategy report vastly higher levels of personal satisfaction with the whole process.
Even if they left money on the table.
Exactly. Because competing claims value, but collaborating preserves the relationship.
Yeah, if you come in swinging like a bulldog and extract every last dime from the hiring manager, sure, you get the cash.
But you've also just established yourself as an adversary to the person who is literally going to be evaluating your performance next month. You win the battle, but poison the well.
Which brings us back to that data we opened with. How do you bridge the gap between the financial windfall of competing and the relationship building of collaborating?
And the answer is intense, scripted preparation. Those candidates earning $20,000 more, they aren't doing it by being aggressive. They're letting the script do the heavy lifting.
Exactly. A script acts as an emotional buffer. When you memorize your transitions and your counteroffers, you drastically reduce your cognitive load.
You aren't desperately searching for the right words in real time, which means you aren't leaking anxiety or aggression through your tone of voice.
Right, you can deliver a highly competitive financial demand with the calm, collaborative demeanor of someone just discussing the weather.
So to our listeners, think about this. What would you say in this situation? How do you ask for more money without sounding aggressive?
Let's actually examine how that sounds in practice, starting with this great tactic known as the non-offer offer.
Oh, I love this one.
Yeah, when you're forced to be the first one to name a number, the goal is to set a high anchor without making a rigid demand that invites immediate conflict.
The phrasing for this is brilliant. So if you're listening, write this phrase down. You say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard that people with my specific skill set typically earn.
And then you insert the absolute highest end of your market research range.
Right. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's such a polite, professional expression.
The psychological mechanism there is the illusion of objectivity. You're distancing your ego from the number. You aren't saying, I want $150,000.
No, you're saying the market dictates this reality. It invites the employer to argue with the macroeconomic data rather than arguing with you personally.
And this brings us to the actual linguistics of the conversation, which is my favorite part.
Me too. The grammar you use in business English completely dictates the power dynamic of the room, specifically when we look at conditionals.
Yes. The difference between closing a deal and ruining a deal often comes down to using the first conditional versus the second conditional.
So a lot of professionals, especially English learners, default to the first conditional because it feels very decisive, right?
Right. Decisive, but potentially disastrous during the bargaining phase. Let's review the grammar quickly. The first conditional uses if plus the present tense, followed by will and the future tense.
So an example would be, if you agree to this salary, I will sign the contract today.
Right. It is incredibly direct. It leaves absolutely zero room for interpretation.
And when the deal is done, it's the perfect grammatical structure to use. But if you use that structure while you are still, thousands of dollars apart, It doesn't sound decisive. It sounds like an ultimatum.
Exactly. It triggers that exact defensive response we are trying to avoid. The employer's brain registers the first conditional as a threat to their autonomy.
Which is why the second conditional is the ultimate linguistic Trojan horse for negotiators. Let's look at how the structure shifts. It becomes if plus the past tense, followed by would.
Right. So instead of if you agree, you say if you agreed to a 5% increase, we would be prepared to move forward.
Let's focus on pronunciation there for a second.
Yeah.
We don't emphasize the would too heavily. It's soft. We'd be prepared. It just flows naturally.
Notice how the biological threat level drops instantly when you say that. By pushing the verb into the past tense with agreed and softening the outcome with would, you're basically transporting the conversation into a hypothetical parallel universe.
You're asking their brain to simply imagine a world where they gave you the money without demanding they actually commit to it in this exact second.
It's brilliant. It allows you to introduce a highly competitive boundary while maintaining a totally collaborative grammatical structure.
You can test the structural integrity of their budget without actually swinging a sledgehammer at it.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. But, even with perfect second conditional grammar and a flawless non-offer, you will inevitably hit a wall.
Oh, for sure. The employer is going to push back.
Right. The initial answer is almost always a polite refusal.
And this is where candidates usually panic and start negotiating against themselves. So how do we handle the rejection?
By utilizing a technique that requires no English vocabulary at all. It's the silence technique.
Oh, this is so hard to do in practice.
It really is. After you deliver your counteroffer, you literally just stop talking. You hold eye contact, and you allow a full 3 to 5 seconds of absolute silence to fill the room.
Listeners, try to imagine that. 3 to 5 seconds in a tense corporate boardroom feels like a geological era. I mean, isn't there a risk that this just comes across as a manipulative staring contest?
Or that they think you forgot your English and just froze.
Yeah, exactly.
The risk is minimal compared to the leverage you gain, though, because of how human beings are socialized. Anthropologically, we interpret conversational silence as a sign of social rupture or disapproval.
Right, nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. Our instinct is to fill that silence with nervous chatter just to repair the social bond. If you give in to that instinct, you'll inevitably start softening your own demand.
You'll say your number, panic at the silence, and immediately follow it up with something like, but I mean, I can be flexible.
And you've just destroyed your own anchor. By forcing yourself to remain silent, you transfer that immense social pressure onto the hiring manager. The person who speaks next is almost always the one who makes a concession.
You're weaponizing their own social conditioning against them. I love it. But let's say they endure the silence.
Okay.
And they come back with the ultimate corporate roadblock. They say, that is our standard offer. The salary bands are strictly non-negotiable.
Right. The classic hands are tied excuse. You don't fight the bureaucracy here. You navigate it. You need a script that acknowledges their constraints while politely requesting an exception.
So what's a good phrase for that?
You respond with something like, I understand you have rigid salary bands. What I'm asking is whether there is flexibility within that specific band based on the unique value I bring.
Oh, that's excellent. You validate their system. You aren't calling them cheap or unreasonable. You are just asking them to utilize the absolute maximum tolerance of their own internal rules.
Exactly. And if they come back and say, no, truly, you are at the ceiling of the band, the base budget is fixed.
That is the moment you pivot back to total compensation. You expand the pie.
Right. And the script for this is seamless. If the base salary is fixed, are there other components we could adjust?
That's a great collocation, adjust components. If they can't give you the cash, you ask for an accelerated 6-month performance review rather than waiting a whole year.
Or you ask for a sign-on bonus because that often hits a totally different internal accounting budget than base payroll.
Right. Or you ask for an extra week of paid time off.
Yeah.
You basically extract the value through a different channel.
But sometimes, none of those channels open. Sometimes the offer is just fundamentally misaligned with your market value. Your beat TNA is way stronger than what they're putting on the table, and you just have to walk away.
Which brings us to polite business English. How do you handle this gracefully? Because you never want to use a flat, definitive no.
Right. A flat rejection burns the bridge.
You have to rely on softening words to preserve the relationship for future opportunities. So listeners, which phrase sounds more professional? Saying, I reject your offer, or saying, unfortunately, I won't be able to accept.
Definitely the second one. You want to use phrases like unfortunately or I am afraid. You don't say I am rejecting this offer. You say I am afraid that offer is lower than I was expecting, so I won't be able to move forward.
Linguistically, I am afraid, is fascinating. It subtly shifts the responsibility away from your personal choice and onto external circumstances.
Right, it frames the rejection as this unfortunate reality that you are both victims of, rather than a hostile action you are taking against them.
It leaves their dignity completely intact. Now, up to this point, every tactic we've discussed, the direct counteroffers, the second conditional, the strategic silence, has been optimized for a very specific environment.
Yes, we are operating under the assumption of a Western low-context business culture.
But the moment your negotiation crosses international lines, the entire rulebook just catches fire.
It really does. Academic research on cultural differences in international business proves that applying a Western script to an Eastern negotiation can be absolutely catastrophic.
Right, we have to look at how different cultures conceptualize logic and time. So Western cultures, like the US and the UK, are heavily rooted in this idea that business is business. They separate the personal from the professional.
And they view time as strictly linear. Time is a resource that is consumed, so efficiency is paramount.
Because of that linear view, Westerners utilize what is called a vertical negotiation style. You take a complex contract and you chop it into distinct sequential pieces.
So you negotiate the base salary first.
Yeah.
Once you agree, you lock it in and you move to the bonus. You lock that in and you move to the start date. It's a highly compartmentalized process.
But contrast that with Eastern cultures like China and Japan, where business is deeply intertwined with guangxi.
Right, that concept of intricate long-term relationship networks and obligations. Furthermore, time is often viewed cyclically over there, focusing on long-term harmony rather than immediate linear resolution.
Which results in a horizontal negotiation style.
Exactly. A horizontal style means nothing is locked in until everything is locked in.
I love the analogy for this. If vertical negotiation is like laying bricks one by one to build a wall, horizontal negotiation is like mapping out an entire architectural blueprint, grading the landscape, and then pouring the entire concrete foundation all at once at the very end.
Mechanically, at the negotiation table, this means an Eastern counterpart will discuss the salary, the bonus, the supply chain, and the start date all simultaneously.
They'll circle back to topics you thought were settled days ago.
Right. Because in a culture driven by guangxi, the contract is secondary to the relationship. They cannot commit to piece A until they are entirely comfortable with how piece Z impacts the holistic partnership.
So if a Westerner walks into a horizontal negotiation and demands that they lock in the base salary before discussing the bonus, like forcing that brick-by-brick method.
The Eastern counterpart won't just see them as impatient. They'll view them as untrustworthy and fundamentally incapable of a nuanced partnership. The deal will just evaporate.
And the danger isn't just in the pacing of the arguments. It extends to the cultural aesthetics of the meeting itself. There's this legendary cautionary tale about a British executive attempting to secure a major partnership with a Chinese enterprise.
Whoa, this story is painful.
It really is. So he knew enough to recognize that gift-giving is a crucial component of relationship building in Chinese business culture. He wanted to bring a traditional offering to the first meeting to demonstrate respect.
Which is a totally well-intentioned strategic move.
Entirely well-intentioned, but executed with zero functional understanding of the culture. He recalled seeing Buddhist statues adorned with offerings in various Asian restaurants back home.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So he purchased a beautifully wrapped set of joss sticks and candles to present to the Chinese executives.
Wow.
For those unfamiliar with the cultural nuance, presenting joss sticks and candles is a horrific misstep. In Chinese tradition, those specific items are strictly reserved for funerals and worshiping the dead. He effectively walked into a multi-million-dollar negotiation and enthusiastically handed his future partners the equivalent of a tombstone.
The deal was dead before they even sat down.
Literally. It proves that all the leverage, BATNAs, and second conditional grammar in the world are utterly useless if you violate a core cultural taboo.
It's the ultimate reminder that negotiation is not a math equation. It's an exercise in applied sociology.
Okay, let's pull all of this together because we've mapped out a highly technical sequence today for our listeners.
It's a lot of great vocabulary and strategy.
It really is. So, just to recap the most useful phrases and strategies, it begins internally. establishing your BATNA to neutralize your biological threat response, allowing you to negotiate from a baseline of calm rather than desperation.
And it requires seeing through the vividness bias, looking past the blinding glare of a massive base salary to evaluate the structural realities of the total compensation package.
Then mastering the psychological distance of the script,
Right.
utilizing the non-offer offer, correct me if I'm wrong, to anchor the room objectively.
And deploying the second conditional, if you accepted, we would be prepared to introduce competitive boundaries without triggering defensive aggression.
Embracing the agonizing 3 to 5 second silence to force the other side to negotiate against themselves. And pivoting to alternative compensation if the base salary band is truly locked.
Finally, recognizing the cultural chessboard you are playing on, adapting your strategy to match either the sequential vertical style of the West or the holistic horizontal style of the East.
It is an incredibly potent toolkit for anyone learning business English. But as we wrap up this deep dive, it's worth looking at the horizon of where these interactions are actually heading. We spent this entire time analyzing the subtle human psychology of the hiring manager sitting across from you.
Right.
But the landscape of human resources is undergoing a massive shift.
We are seeing the rapid acceleration of algorithmic HR. Companies are increasingly deploying artificial intelligence to establish ultra-rigid, dynamic salary bands based on real-time market data.
And even more alarming for the candidate, some corporations are already utilizing AI chat interfaces to conduct initial screening negotiations.
Which completely neutralizes half the toolkit we just discussed. I mean, an algorithm does not feel social discomfort during a 5-second silence.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And an algorithm's amygdala isn't soothed by your perfect use of the second conditional.
Exactly. As compensation becomes increasingly dictated by machine logic rather than human discretion, the window for this kind of nuanced relational bargaining may be closing.
Which leaves us with a pretty critical realization. The ability to sit across from another human being and masterfully articulate your financial worth in English is currently one of the most powerful levers you have to build wealth.
Yeah, but as corporate systems become more rigid and automated, human-to-human negotiation might not remain a standard part of the hiring process for much longer. It might just become a luxury reserved only for the highest echelons of executive leadership.
So a provocative thought to leave you with. While the human element is still at the table, how much longer can you afford to leave your scripts at home?
Something to really think about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of English Effect. We hope this deep dive gave you the confidence and the vocabulary to tackle your next salary negotiation.
Make sure to follow the podcast for future practical English lessons, and please like and share the episode if you found it useful.
And don't forget to watch the companion YouTube lesson for visual explanations and on-screen vocabulary. You can also download the e-free PDF vocabulary companion using the link provided in the episode description.
Join us again for the next lesson. Keep practicing, keep speaking, and we'll see you next time.